Hello, join us.
I don't want to disrupt what you're trying to gather your thoughts, but I was curious to know what this session is about. I just saw the title.
Yes, it's about architecture.
Okay.
It's about kind of history, meaning of architecture, and how it can be employed in the present for people that are, as everybody in this room is thinking about the need to manage or build buildings in the future. So, yeah.
Perfect. That's what we're looking for.
Oh, great.
This way.
I'm also Chris. Yes. I haven't registered yet. I came here to work. Glad to have you.
Yeah.
We've talked about a lot of stuff this morning, so you'll come in the middle.
Okay.
You and Paul, but glad to have you.
Glad to be here.
Where are you from?
We're both from Tyler, Texas.
Okay.
Sure.
Great.
What do we miss?
I talked about just a bunch of stuff. I talked about kind of using the model here of the trivia. We've talked about the grammar, historic grammar of architecture, the way that it has parts that are essentially memorized, and in different kind of different flexible ways. We're going to talk briefly about how those things come together in a way that I think can be judged. I think it's comparable to logic. But I think the thing we really need to get to is I'm going to show some slide presentations made to a school that was in a process of, or is in a process of acquiring land, of being on 3 campuses. How we're helping them understand what it is they're imagining they want, and hoping that's going to bring up another host of questions that have been brought by people anyway. So.
It's very pertinent for us because our school is a subsidiary of our church.
Yes.
And our church is finally starting to build a new sanctuary that's been years in the making. But we also acquired some land last year. It's got about 9 acres on it. And so trying to be thoughtful about elements of that property, long-term use. Just glad to see that this was on the agenda.
Well, you know, it's, there's a graduate program in leadership at Golden College, and we'll cop into this for cross-school school administrators. One of the, yes, not privy to the actual conversation, but I think one of the founders of that group, John Still, professor, one professor at Golden College, and he and I known each other for around about 10 years or so, and into this curriculum, he wrote a place for adult environment. And he's written a little book called Making School Beautiful Again. And so I'm going to teach this course at the Golden curriculum later this summer. But moving to Richmond, I did this past summer, meeting the economics at Veritas School and getting our cook and my connection at Gordon College. And so it turned out to a one-day workshop here. So I'm hoping, I'll hope to persuade Eric that we should do this every year. I'd certainly like to come back and keep doing this.
Absolutely.
I'll know even more what to expect next time.
I saw a little bit of it online. It looks like you've done some consulting on projects for building.
Yes, so I've spent 22 years in academia. Before that, working in architecture, but then teaching architecture, teaching classical architecture and humanly scaled urbanism. And because I think partly because John Still's book is basically, is written so much from Alberti's treatise on architecture, of which I'm a scholar. A lot of what I've taught and presenting this morning, actually this afternoon, is in some way owed to that. But this past August, I returned to practice from Richmond, Virginia. And we have a long-standing studio practice in schools. And we're making it clear that we can serve the community. So
That's great.
Working with a school in Northeast Ohio, to search for peace of land. So we're in the thick of it.
I brought you one. This one's got cream sugar. This is just black. Whatever you prefer. I'll drink it either way.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
The marvel of generosity. Well, let's tell more, Michael. You knew your way around the Velvet Taco, and you treated us to some amazing queso. So you're pretty special too.
We're ready to go.
Yes, sir.
You want to go over your bio with the new books, or do you want to?
I think I just did that.
Okay, good. And then
Oh.
you need to turn that on like this.
Hmm.
I'm sorry. I'm sleeping back.
No.
We asked since we were going to do Spain in the second half if we could take a siesta.
Push a button. You know which button to push? I didn't push the button to begin with, so. I wonder if it's, I'm not in Keynote, so I wonder if that's, oh, it's okay. Well, I was going to not do what I left.
Just unplug it, like
Thank you.
outlet. I don't know what was plugged into that.
That's coming back. Okay. You all see that? Great. So I think I will where we left off before lunch was I had an illustration up on the screen that I think I'm going to put aside because the time does go rapidly. But I will tell you, it's a concept of what's called the transect. And the transect is if you are in environmental science, you might recognize this term. It's used in environmental science to chart that certain animal species, plant species happen in either because of climate or weather, and you can map these geographically. And so architects in some circles have been saying, well, buildings are that way too, that you make a certain kind of building in a city and you make a less intense kind of building in the country, and that there's a whole scale of these kinds of adjustments that are made in terms of density and social activity in this spectrum called a transect. And but I think I'm going to not spend any more time on that. I think I will go right to this this slideshow that was prepared for the Heritage Classical Academy, and hopefully I'm not going to divulge anything here that they wouldn't want me to share. I don't think anything's private here, but the Heritage Classical Academy is located in Northeast Ohio between Akron and Cleveland. And they're in a process not unlike what I've heard this morning of having campuses in 3 places, seeing the end of leases in arrangements in 2 churches, and the need to build a rhetoric school. And so they would hope in a couple of years to be in a place where they have an historic school that they're in. It's a keeper, and to bring closure to situations where they've occupied schools, churches, and then build a purpose-built rhetoric school. And actually, I think it's K through 12. And so we engaged with them, and they expressed really clearly that they need to be in a building in August 2024. Well, that seems like a long way away, except when you're doing buildings, it's around the corner. And so one of the things that we had to do was kind of show them how we need to spend the next 2 years in order to get them in a building in August 2024. And that would assume that they had acquired a piece of land in early June. And there was a time in late May and early June where it looked like this is going to happen, right? They had their eye on a piece of property. It looked like it was going to fit the bill. It had some existing buildings which could be fitted, some in the long term and some in the short term. And so that was going on. They're looking for land, and we are helping them, first of all, kind of a 2-stage thing, helping them understand how their vision could be articulated in a way that would imply what the buildings would be, which is a very difficult thing to do. All of the schools that you're associated with, I'm sure, have really clear mission statements, right? I mean, that's probably one of the strengths of any institution is. Actually, it's an operative, powerful, motivating mission statement or vision statement that causes you to do some things and keeps you from doing others. So they had that. And what we were trying to do is move that vision statement to a statement that would also have some implications about what this built environment would be. So some early phrases came out. You know, they talked about how their grammar school atmosphere was intended to be peaceful, and I'm sure that's not unusual in this community. And maybe I heard the word home, and so those are key words, because those are words that begin to talk about buildings, right? Somebody else talked about the benefits of having everybody under one roof, and then there was the immediate, well, we're not so sure about that. Well, those are both implications for buildings, right? Under one roof or not, right? So listening to keywords and helping them fashion those kinds of things that might have an implication for the built environment. So that was kind of a vision workshop we did remotely. It was an hour and a half after some prep on our part. Another part of this, or this most recent part, one that we're still in the middle of reporting, was a programming workshop. So so a programming workshop, of course, we're familiar with that word, or maybe it's been replaced by a word that we use, which is coding, right? In architect, in software design, we call it coding now, right? Instead of programming. But for architects, programming is a written description. This means I need to stop talking. That's what it means. A written description as clear as can be that is a point of agreement, or actually it's presented by the school to us, but in this case, we're helping them write this, that then guides us going forward about how to make a building that meets their vision. So I'm just going to kind of flip through this and kind of give you a sense of what it was that we talked about. We had to explain to them what program is, right? We kind of defined this. We won't spend time on this. We had them do a little exercise. It's the year 2030, and you're on the HCA campus that opened in the fall of 2024, and for a weekend, and you're writing a postcard about the campus. What is it you're going to write? Getting at what it is that you imagine would be the thing that you would value, right? We made, it was a similar story this morning about, are you making a campus that is so iconic, and sometimes we use those words, or so beautiful that that people might want to have engagement or wedding photos or reunion photos in front of some building on your campus. A lot of campuses are nondescript, right? There isn't a place where you would want to do that. We kind of did this little diagram with some excerpts from things that were written. And you kind of see what came out of that. But I think this is an interesting thing to do. They talked about some aspects of the building, the old school they have that they'd like to bring forward into a new building. The library and the gym they liked. Somebody mentioned that on one of the campuses they had sunny classrooms and shared common spaces, and those things should reverberate with some of the conversations we had this morning, right? The classroom is tended to be peaceful and home-like. And then somebody corrected that, said not home-like, but peaceful, right? Okay, fine, good. We're getting greater clarity. That's good, right? This is a little bit like some of you are engaged in therapy or listening facilitators. It's not unlike that. I'm showing you 3 images on the right because in the first exercise, the vision statement exercise, I did a thing which I described, which was using a Microsoft Form tool, where I said, well, what kind of campus are you thinking about? When you're thinking campus, what does it look like? And is it around a quadrangle? Is it buildings in a circle? Is it a long linear path? What kind of architecture does it have? Lots of columns, no columns? Does it, and so it was, I don't know, it was 25 images. Well, the 3 that came out most strongly in this first vision statement are the ones that are on the right. They love this this school building. It's in Atlanta by a really, really gifted early 20th century American architect. For those of you who think I'm only showing European things. I'm exaggerating to make a point. This is a really, really gifted Atlanta architect. And this school is now, I think, called the International School or something, but they keep gravitating to this image. It looks like school to them, but without being, this has come up a couple times, and you might find this is close to your own thinking. They want a building that looks school-like and has dignity, but they want to be sure that it's not pretentious or showy. Well, okay, I hear that, right? And I think that they might have gravitated to this photo at the top right because it is school-like, it's big. Maybe that's a sense of it being showy, but it's not pretentious. It's just handsome. It's beautiful. Maybe the circular image of buildings around a central circular green. And then they like the idea of this bottom right image of a school, of a building that would frame an outdoor place like a theater, right? For education. We helped them kind of work through some words that they wanted to see in a vision statement. You see that we put all these words on the left, and then they could choose. They could put words into the bank, and then we would choose whether they should be used or hold or don't use. And I think I put future-proofed in as a. Do you want a campus that's future-proofed? And a bunch of people said yes, yes, yes. But when we talked about it more, they thought that was a word that was not a word they would use. And so we ditched that word. And you could see the words that they, as a group, the consensus was around words like welcoming and beauty and goodness, for God's glory, truth, wonder, inspiring, enduring, community building. And so then we craft a little temporary vision statement up here in the top bar on the right, which we've asserted that this will change over this process, that it will gain more clarity, more specificity over time, but that's where we start. So create a new campus that's welcoming, inspiring, and of enduring beauty, to serve the kingdom, cultivate a love of learning, wonder, stewardship, and community building for God's glory. So my guess is that nobody in the room would find that a terrible statement, but one that might be close to your own. So I did some more of these surveys, and so it was 5 different kind of areas that we were exploring with them. That seems to have been pictured here with 7 images. So one of the issues with it was a campus with connections. So is it a big roof or not? And so I showed them a whole series of buildings of campuses with discrete buildings that are connected in some way. Are they connected with out-of-door connections, or are they weather connections, right? And while there's many, many good schools with open-to-air connections between buildings, this is Northeast Ohio, and they felt like they needed to have protection from the climate. So they gravitated to the 2 images that you see the top left, these 2 images of campuses with connections. So we're getting a better sense of what they're imagining. In a sense, that's what architecture is. In a sense, it's building out a shared imagination. And I mean that in the most positive sense, right? And so we're trying to put legs on these ideas, these images, these visions that they have of what this school should be like. The idea of an outdoor room that persisted, although I tried many other images. This is the one that they hung with. It's interesting. And which is gratifying, because this is a building that my firm did. I think for the Virginia Episcopal School, through a long process to serve them. Oh, I mentioned this welcome. So they want a welcoming campus, and I went and Googled most welcoming campus photo and put it in there with 10 others or 12 others, and the one they chose was the one that everybody chooses. This is it, the most welcoming campus. I'm sorry there's so much light on the screen. If there wasn't a danger of sleeping, we could turn off the perimeter light. Maybe it's okay. They want to build a library, and we showed them 15 pictures of library interiors, and they liked this one most, in the center column. And I think they liked it because it has both light, natural light. We talked a lot about that this morning, and because it has some lines that are traditional or historic in its shape and language. So they need a multi-purpose room, and I gave them many, many choices. And they chose the two here that I mentioned this morning. Who doesn't want that gem at the bottom, right? Oh, yeah, we want that gem. And, you know, I hope we can do that.
That's why there's a shortage of glass, right?
Yeah. Well, it is interesting, you know, there's a relationship between light and glass, isn't there? Yes, and Paul.
Oh, sorry. It's not chosen by a basketball player. I think she.
Well, yeah, that's only the count, the games that don't count, right? So the games that count are going a long ways in the room, maybe.
Can you help me understand what it is about the Tom Central photo that people think of as particularly welcoming?
Well,
Because
let me just try this.
Big, expansive, you know, open door exactly. It kind of looks like a wall of guard towers on either side. That might just be more vision.
Oh, can we do that? Is that okay?
That's good.
You know what? I could find other photos, and other photos might explain more, because from a different angle, you see the college buildings beyond or through the opening. And I think if you Google this image, you'll see that they garden it beautifully. There's flowers that adorn the entrance here, and so it is walled. It's marking that this is a different place, but it is also suggesting that it's open and it's beautiful. And so that's how I would explain the preference for it.
Thank you.
So actually, and these two vertical posts with a wall and an opening, that, I mean, the history of people building such things and understanding that this means door, right, goes way back. In fact, maybe you'll be interested in this. Some of you might know enough Romance languages to know that the word, portal, right? Yes, which is also a verb for carrying, right? And so that's not intuitively obvious why those two words are connected, right? But in town building, Roman town building, they would take a plow around where the wall would be, and the furrow would be cast out on one side or the other. And then where the gates would be, they would lift the plow. So they're carrying for the door, right? So the idea of stiles, which is the posts of a door, that door has two stiles. Wandering through Scottish pastures, there's stiles. These things are the most fundamental signs of entry. And they're written into.
Out of curiosity, in this project, these options. Eclectic mix that suits them, I said. It's, but at one point in time, in projects like this, you say, here's everything we can't do. School contracts, well, we can do three of them. And what kind of complications does that fit in there? We put all our emphasis on the outside exterior, all our resources there. We're going to compromise on the inside. Our library can't be up to snuff. Our gates, of course, have to be cheaper. This can cut costs. How much is the dynamic of that?
Well, it's always a dynamic, right? I mean, I'm talking about real things too, right? And so I think that the schools that we're engaging are in this for the long haul, right? And they understand this is what we want, and it may take 20 years to get there, or it might take 50 years, right? So we build a little bit, and we choose carefully what is the thing that we want to build first. Can we make it the best it can be in the short term? Can it be improved in the long term? Is it something that people will want to, because they see how it belongs to a greater vision, a longer vision, that they'll want to support over the long haul?
That's a tough answer.
Well,
I
because
appreciate it. I'm all on board with it. I mean, you know, with parents who are the third graders saying, I want to build it in 5 years. Or it's third grader without that you get you through, but obviously the council, same thing with donors. They want to see it.
So you're seeing the front end here where we're trying to help them understand for their own sakes what it is that they're imagining and what it is that they're valuing. At the end of the show, we're showing them what it costs, and it's frightening. So it's not like there's a long path of, you know, we're not deceiving people that, but we're holding the two in tandem, right? Of this is what you're imagining. This is what you want. This is what you say your values point you to. This is what it costs. These are what the constraints are in the present. And is this a process then that you want to undertake over a long period? So my firm, Glavin Homes, has been at this long enough that we are working with people on master plans where we're going back for the second, third time to do the next building in that plan, right? So yeah, there's not a better answer for, I mean, maybe Keith back there at the 3D printer, maybe that's going to be the answer, maybe.
Well, honestly, that's why I've been looking at some of those things, just how do you get the cost of buildings down, but still don't give up on aesthetic.
Well, that's exactly where we're at too. Yeah, that's what that was implicit in my earlier question about faux. Things that look good but are really out in their hollow, or they're cheap, or and obviously you'd always prefer to do that.
Well, you know, I think that there are some ways to approach this. Simple buildings, a building with good proportions made of that can be a setting for improvement over time is better than, I would say, an ill-shaped building with that can't be improved over time. So the first mistake in making a bad building is that the proportions are bad, right? And this is not something that we know this. Everybody involved in industrial design knows this, right? They know the shape of the thing actually is fundamentally important. I think this, I'm showing you a PDF, and so I think it does this, whereas the keynote didn't, but I'll ask for your grace in this. But you know, an iPhone has a proportion that's probably a Greek two-dimensional proportion, and Apple they're brilliant in their industrial design, so they're using a shape that we have for a long time practiced and interest in, right? So they're doing a beautiful thing, a beautiful shape fundamentally first, and then and that's where the first mistake can be made as well. So you want to make a building that has simple proportions. It is simple, and over time could be a host, if you will, for better materials, better windows, and some limited ornament. You know, if you build a door, but then somebody in your parents is a fine woodworker can build an ornamented door that can be added to a building, right?
I don't know how I conversation with this is further. Sort of light earlier, and then part of the prioritization cost. More with some idea in certain spaces of stained glass. Very beautiful.
That's right.
Cost. Discussion. But bring your see replaceable in the future. So excited with that.
What?
I mean, they are beautiful. I'd say some balance.
So while we've talked about the value of natural light, there might be places in in a ensemble of buildings, a chapel, for example, where you might be willing to relinquish some of that natural light in favor of what can be done with that light through coloring it, right? Now, historically, those stained glass windows were done partly because they were a way of communicating. Right, they were didactic. Maybe yours are going to be didactic. Maybe they're not. So that can be done, right? I mean, that you can make that decision. I think they would, if it was used everywhere, I think it would be dark. Now, here's one more aspect about light, and it might be truer in a building that with stained glass windows, is that we experience light in two different ways. We experience light when a building is open to natural light. We see the way the sun moves through the day and through a season. And both of those give a kind of a richness to life and connect us to the cosmology, if you will, right? In a way that a building can uniquely do. So if you think about your own experience of buildings, or maybe your home, there's places in your home where, I mean, I like light in the morning. I like that sunlight in the morning. I gravitate toward it. That's where I want to eat my breakfast, right? I want to eat my breakfast where there's some morning sun, right? That happens on a daily basis. But there's other places in any building where the sun is in different places during the course of the year, right? I lived for 20 years in the Chicago area, and the house on the Midwest grid was absolutely north, east, south, and west. Well, there was 3 weeks a year at the summer solstice when the sun was north of west, north of east. So there were a few days when the sun would actually come into the north side of our house, because that's where the sun is, early summer near the solstice. It's that far, it's north of east and west when it sets west and when it rises in the north. So buildings can be both make us more aware of the seasonal movement of the sun and the daily movement of the sun, both of which are really important to us as human beings. Churches have historically been markers of the seasonal or annual movement of the sun. Maybe not American churches. I'm sorry, I'm going back to Europe. And where there would be a hole, for example, big church in Bologna in Italy has a hole in the roof, and then the floor is marked as a bit of a linear sundial, and you see the passage of the sun, which is connected to liturgy for many of us, right? And so you're seeing the sun, which is a real marking of the liturgy that some of us practice in a year, right? So these things are the sun, the building, the year, the liturgy, it's all being tied together in a way that is deeply meaningful, right? Is that an answer about whether you should do stained glass? I don't know. But what I hope I can do is widen the number of things that you imagine are things that buildings can do, even the simplest buildings. I mean, some of the places that people want to visit in Europe, for example, a Portuguese village or a Spanish village or an Italian village, the buildings are not expensive, right? They were cheap buildings and still are. The buildings themselves are not expensive. It's expensive to replicate that in a regulatory atmosphere that we have, right? But those buildings that we find beautiful are not in themselves expensive. They have good proportions and they frame where it is that we walk in ways that enhance our experience of our lives, in ways that makes us, I would say, more in tune, more appreciative, more grateful for our humanity, for our creatureliness, right? I think those are all things that buildings can lead us to. Yeah, please. Yeah.
maybe you addressed this in an earlier session, but as far as building for schools particularly, have you ever thought about what the biggest sins are, errors to avoid as far as this will make a school feel oppressive or useless or whatever?
Well, I mean, we've been struggling with this morning with natural light, and then the massive challenge of security, contemporary security in buildings, right? And I don't pretend to have the answer on that question, which is way bigger than architecture. It's a cultural question at the moment.
Yeah, the thing that people have that you would say are absolutely just common mistakes.
Are there black spots? Yeah.
Yeah, like,
Oh, don't do this.
shouldn't build portico here ever.
Well, I think the most important thing is making rooms that can be naturally daylit. And if they could be ventilated, naturally ventilated, that would be, so making mistakes of not having natural light in a school classroom, that would be, for me, a terrible mistake. One that you might have to live with in the short term, but you'd want to solve in the long term. Acknowledging that we have constraints. I think that you'd want to build a building that would make it easier for community. So Stalin, bring Stalin into this conversation. We were waiting for that one. So he in the houses for the people, he arranged them such that people could share nursery and cooking, but never could congregate in groups large enough that he thought would be dangerous as conditions for revolt. So I think you want to not imitate Stalin. You want to make places that architecture has gone through a kind of a bad phase in the early 20th century where we thought, it goes back to the introduction of the Enlightenment, where we thought that a building rationally produced could solve all of our problems, all humanity's problems, right? That if we were just rational enough, we could do it. And so we architects, and maybe this is a part of the professional arrogance that I won't pretend is not present. We have been tempted to think that buildings are the condition that cause people to do what it is that we think we need them to do, right? And that's way overstepping what buildings can do. I think it's better to say that buildings can support and not get in the way of the things that you value, right? So I think that's a healthier way to correctly set the ambitions for what a building can do. You want it to be a condition that supports and doesn't prohibit or create an obstacle in the things that you do value. And some of those things are community building, I would say, ultimately. Yeah. Paul.
Let's talk about buildings having, I'm not sure, beautiful or appropriate is the right word, beautiful or appropriate shape and proportion. Do they derive their beauty and appropriateness from their purpose and function, or are there just sorts of fundamental rules, like the golden ratio? We figured out there's this set of numbers that for some reason you plug them together and people are just happier in a space that looks like this, or is it a bit of both?
I love these questions, and is it going to be okay if we just live with this kind of going to sleep and then I wake it up when is that going to be okay? So this is a great question, and Paul and Christopher, you weren't here in the morning, but my scholarship had to do with the first Renaissance treatise in architecture by an Italian Alberti, and it's actually on that question. So. And it seems like aesthetic philosophers are reinforcing this, that we won't agree that something is beautiful unless we know what it is. Well, I can't tell you if that's beautiful if you won't tell me what the thing is. There's an ontology here that we want to have answered, right? What is the thing? my children were swimmers, and I spent a lot of time in chlorinated atmospheres and waiting, right? And so one day I brought some drawings of a building that was going to be a library for our town. And I just decided it would be interesting to circulate this among parents who are all waiting. What kind of building is this? And as they circulated, they said, oh, this is a small airport. Right. So they were, and this is the, not to, make this too grand a question, but, Aristotle tells us that our first question is, we wonder, right? We want to know the meaning of the things that we see. And so, but it wasn't a small town airport, it was a library. And so the architect, in my view, failed because we can't identify the purpose of the building by its appearance. And so then it's harder to judge about whether it's beautiful or not. So another thing I'll say here is, I think I said this morning, is that in architecture schools where I've taught for a long time, contemporary architectural education will dismiss the ideal of beauty, saying, oh, it's only in the eye of the beholder, as if we can't do that because nobody agrees, right? And they will settle for it, and they will assert that what is important is it's challenging, it's remarkable, it's cool, right? Those are acceptable critical words in the training of architects for buildings, right? Well, aesthetic philosophers, I mean, you can go to something like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which I think is a pretty good standard. It's one of the few things on the internet that probably is trustworthy, right? And a very good aesthetic philosopher there says that that while that kind of thing is said, none of us live that way. We live as if we agree generally about what's beautiful. But he also says, he hinges that with our need to know what the thing is. So once we know what the thing is, then we will enter into the conversation about whether it's beautiful or not, right? So is it a house, or is it a school, or what is that? And once we know that, then we will, because the question of propriety actually is fundamental to us. Well, I don't want to say that that's beautiful and then find out it's this awful thing, because then I've used the word beautiful for something that should be just and good, right? Or true and good.
Makes his opinion wrong,
Pardon?
even if the purpose is different than what he anticipated, what makes his perception or observation of beauty wrong?
Building's an abortion clinic, doesn't matter how beautiful it is on the outside, and that's called beautiful.
And you use that example of the whole heart, helps that.
Yeah. Well, let's hope you don't have any buildings that are, but you might have a building that's, where you keep the lawnmowers, right?
Right.
The degree of effort on that building is going to be much less. So these things are hinged together. Beauty and appropriateness are hinged together. The question of appropriateness, propriety, is really a cognition question. Do I recognize the thing as being what it is, right? Do I recognize it? And that comes from a long history of building things in certain ways, right? So I could be shown a traditional building in West Africa, and I because I haven't grown up in West Africa, I wouldn't know what the thing is and be able to judge then whether it's beautiful or not. But if I was to live there for some years and learn what that thing is and identify it, then I might still be reticent to enter into whether I think it's beautiful, because beauty is both cultural in complex ways, and it may be transcendent. There's a long history of people in the West, at least, thinking that proportions are some intimation of splendor. And I'm thinking of Gerard Manley Hopkins now, right? That there is some splendor, or maybe Leonard Cohen, maybe he's your prophet, right? There's a crack in the ceiling and the light comes through, right? And so beauty might be our efforts to make something that we would suggest in offering. If this is the best I can do, I offer it as something that might be, that might be a splinter of heavenly splendor. I just went really theological there, but these things are connected. Propriety and beauty. There's a cognition, and then there's something that is that is impossible to describe. Beauty is impossible to describe, but we often know when we see it.
Starting on that, I was going to ask a question. Same hold true for type. You know, there's only we know it's a school. Does it change your perception of either type?
Well, so the type, and this is bringing back what we talked about this morning. A type is a verbal description, almost a thumbnail, if you will, of a building that is in its. So if we think of type as being genus, in its species, it's being ornamented in a way that's recognizable as being appropriate.
Well, the reason I asked that question is, for example, I know that classical schools, from my perspective, are beautiful. There's philosophy, theology, orientation, approach to education.
And you're talking about an institution now.
You're right. So that's
Yeah,
right.
okay.
But in their physical campus,
Right.
there's a billion different incantations. Some are in churches that may be very beautiful. Some are in built at a local school when they're a public school that was built in the 1950s with a square little rectangle. They're ugly. So I would say that's a beautiful school, but it's not physically.
It's beautiful because the institution is beautiful. Right. Yes, and then part of our challenge mentally is it is beautiful because we believe in what's taking place there, and we wish it looked like that, right? There's this great verse. It's Titus 2:10, I think, that says that we adorn with our behavior what it is that we believe, essentially. So those two words are coming together, right? What our theology is, we practice in our conduct, and that becomes the ornament. That's the word in the Latin, at least. That is a proper outworking of the thing that we believe, right? That's what we want, right? We're terribly deceived when a person is beautiful, but they are a creep, right? That just hurts for us. It doesn't seem, it's not right. It's wrong, right? And it's easier for us to learn to appreciate the beauty of a person who might be physically disfigured, but for whom we see in them that there is this triumph, right? Or even that there's value as them as human beings. It's easier for us to go that way, at least prayerfully, right? Although we're so seduced by the appearance. We're complex that way, right? We're made to be moved by beauty. We're deceived by it. And we want to make things this side of heaven that practice the New Jerusalem. That's what I would say to my architecture students. This is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. We are practicing the New Jerusalem. Does that elevate? Is this we're keeping the rain off, the toilets work for people in wheelchairs. That's all important. And then there's another step, right? That is truly motivating for us and ties what we do to things much larger than ourselves. I mean, not that service to others doesn't, but we've raised the ante about what a building is. Oh, you looking for that verse?
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's Titus 2:10. No?
That's not slavery. Yeah.
I think it's the last half of that verse.
10. not to steal from them, but to show them that they can be fully trusted, but in every way they will make the teaching about God or so they're attractive.
That's the phrase. Attractive is the word. Few Latinists in the room. That's from which we get ornament. So we think about ornament these days as being the fluff, right? Right. If you look in an old, you look in the old Oxford English Dictionary, one of the first uses of ornament is to describe your right hand. So ornament actually meant, historically, it meant equipping a thing for its purpose. So it looked like it does the thing it should do. There's a long, long history of this. Or I've made this, you know, if you're making I'm thinking of my students, my former students, if they were to make a birthday cake for a kid brother, kid sister, and said, well, you don't need the icing because that's just the fluff. You wanted the cake, I've given you the cake, there's the birthday cake. That does not count, right? It does not count. That is not a birthday cake. It needs its ornament. There's if some of you are interested in this, there's an old English scholar named Kumar Swami who's written about the history. He's also an American theologian, I believe, using some thoughts from Augustine on the role of ornament as an equipping of things. Very, very powerful argument. Where did we start?
Sorry.
No, that's all good stuff. Beauty and ornament are hinged in complicated ways, in important ways.
I can't help but think too, that there's a contrast. You take this discussion on higher level, there's obviously attention to classical education and modern education, especially with what's happening in the current context of public education. I know for a fact that the town in Illinois that I came from building projects and maintaining all their schools and redoing all their campuses. And they're just as intentional in their philosophy of what their buildings look like to make it look like their didactic purpose.
Yes.
Which I happen to believe is all horrific.
Yes.
But it was, they let the kids pick the design of the building.
Yeah.
All that, let them pick the name of it, with certain designers, et cetera. Because, it was all reflective of an equitable building. All buzzwords that you can imagine that are public education right now is going to be designed for campus. So that's tension between how you want your campus to be didactic for teaching it as well as absorb that atmosphere.
Let me warn you about another way we can fall off that horse. And because ideas in the abstract can be ones that we welcome. And when you build that out in the real stuff of buildings, you realize, oh my goodness, what have I done? So we lived in a town where it seemed like what could be more perfect than this? A circular school building where all the classrooms have a relationship to a library in the middle of the building. Well, the way that works out is that you either had to go outside or through the library to get to every classroom, and every classroom was pie-shaped. The building is a total disaster.
Just by the description, it sounds like a disaster.
So, well, because I'm leading the question, I'm making it worse than.
Set up your classroom desks in a triangle.
So it doesn't work. So it's a school that, that they can only partly use because it's such a disaster. But here's my point here is that sometimes, and this is especially true, I think architects can say things that are ideas that we will give assent to. And then when they build that abstraction, it is a disaster because it's not taking into account our humanity in a place or our connections to what a school looks like or the practicalities of a room with corners or the length of a pie-shaped room. All these things might have sounded good as ideas. And when they're worked out in real terms, I might say in ornament, you realize that they were wrong-headed. So you want, this might be a thing to look for in an architect, is you want an architect where the ideas are ones that can be worked out in ways that, let me put this differently. There probably aren't any new ideas about architecture. People haven't changed. I mean, despite what postmoderns tell us, right, that we're entirely social constructions, we are fundamentally the same. And so the architects there's a huge pressure on architects to have novel ideas and to make it look like something you've never seen before, because it's spectacular, right? And we are seduced into thinking in a way that it must be good if we've never seen it before. Well, it must be new, and new is good, therefore it's good. Some of you are much deeper into logic than I am, and you can find the faults of that.
I want to explore a little bit here.
Yeah.
I want to build upon your comment about modern architecture.
I was talking about modern public education.
Yeah, I want to draw upon that as a corollary. It's like, so we're here looking for insights into the classical model of education, leading off with setting the architectural stage in order to create that cultural environment that begets classical education. That if we were to be Rustums that were into a modern school architecture environment to conduct classical education classes, we'd be fighting an uphill battle because the cognitive cultural connection would not be there.
That is true. On the other hand, we are blessed to be immensely adaptable, right? People survive, human beings were able to survive concentration camps. So we can, extraordinary people can do that. Is that what we want to do? And is that an environment in which most of us can thrive? No, we want to have, it is a blessing, a common grace for everyone to have the experience of beauty and have the building speak to us in ways that expresses the values of our education.
My takeaway on the track is we're really wanting a classical educational environment to speak to the culture of the learning and knowledge. That we cannot locate a facility or a campus that supports that theme, then we should move on. Not battle that constant daily cognitive interference, I'll call it. It's like you go to the movie theater to watch a high technicolor film and you show it in black and white.
Yeah.
The kind of not going to want to stay.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good challenge, right? And so I will caution you that buildings can never, right? They can never be determinants for human behavior. But they either are conditions for, or we can prevent them from being obstacles to, right? So on two levels, a beautiful building is supporting that classical education because in ways that we understand it's one of the three transcendentals, right? And that is reinforcing what we're teaching. The other thing that is true about this, about classical architecture that we haven't talked about yet, is its symbol carrying capacity. One of the characteristics of architecture of the 20th century, modernist architecture, is that the symbol carrying capacity was stripped away because it was believed to be oppressive, right? So if terrible people use symbols to represent their rule, then therefore all buildings that carry symbols are bad, right? That was the argument used in the early 20th century. Because we are people who are constantly wanting signs to read, classical architecture is intended to carry meanings, right? So, for example, you could you could have figural ornament that is representing educational ideals, right? It could be an educator that it could be an educator that your school is patterning itself after, right? I mean, there's a Chesterton Academy, I think, in Ohio. I mean, there could be figures of G.K. Chesterton. You could be creating emblems of what's going on in the building that is valuable.
We're the animals. So, I mean, it's almost an article.
Well, there's a virtue of moderation too.
I mean, our first review were an anchor, so, so the anchor is our symbol, it's our logo, which is fine, it's good marketing. It's reinforcement, but not the whole thing, almost to the point.
And I'll just
Come up with another name.
And I'll just add this, that columns can actually be, the ones I've shown you are not, they don't have legible iconographic meaning, but early in the United States, we had buildings in Washington, D.C. that had tobacco leaf capitals and that kind of thing, because what they were doing was bringing the language into a particularity with this new place, right? And I think there's a lot of room for that in the present classical architecture, is to make more of the symbol bearing capacity of it.
Yes, so jumping back a little bit, with new constructions, how can we incorporate ornament in a more fundamental way? So it's not just frilly little additions. I can get a hold of, when you design a building, wanting it to be efficient and effective and designed well for its purpose. Where that kind of rubs me the wrong way a little bit is that it's very utilitarian, and then afterwards it's like, okay, and now let's try to make it beautiful.
Yeah, good point.
Help me. Can you break down how you can, how to go about construction and design in such a way that you're not wholly enslaved to utility, but are incorporating that older idea of ornament we talked about a moment ago.
Yeah, I'm glad you're so self-aware there, that the way that we measure the effectiveness of buildings these days is whether they are efficient, right? And this is part of the reason that buildings last such a short time, is that we make them so, I'll use your word, enslaved to the program, that when the use changes slightly, the building isn't efficient anymore, and then we get rid of it. So historically, buildings were a little bit more, maybe the Brits would use the word redundant. There's a little bit more margin, so they can be used differently over time when the uses change slightly. But we also want to, when we say purpose, we want to always be reminding ourselves that the purpose isn't entirely its efficiency, right? Oh, is the purpose also that it be beautiful? Is the purpose also that it be a didactic tool? Is the purpose of this building also to help us with our emotional well-being, because we can see the sun in the wintertime, right? So a building, whenever we're using those words, which we've been persuaded should only talk about price per square inch and, efficiency, can we back away from that and say, but our purpose is larger than that? It might take us longer to get there. We're going to pay more for it, but we're saying that our purpose is greater than the mere efficiency. There is a long-standing debate in the history of architecture about classical ornament. Is it a thing that's added on to, or is it integral to the thing, right? And in contemporary practice, it kind of comes down to whether a person is an advocate of British classical architecture, maybe even Georgian architecture. And it goes back to Rome, where the buildings are mostly wall buildings, and then they applied stuff as they wanted to, but they were mostly walls. And by contrast, this so many things go back to the beginning. And you all know this, it's Plato and Aristotle and Jesus, right? And but the Greeks never used ornament, never used columns where the columns weren't bearing the weight of the building, right? So some practitioners in the present will only use columns where the columns are actually doing the real work, not just the apparent work, not the fictive work, but the real work, the fictive and the real work of holding up the building. And some people will say that that's they will argue that that's better. I'm not going to come down one way or the other. That's just another way of thinking about this. So and probably what that means, and this is true in Greek buildings, aside from the Parthenon, if you just strip away the Parthenon and all those temple buildings, the Greeks as a rule used very few columns because they were only carrying weight. The Romans, we can build walls, we've got concrete, we can do whatever we want. Let's put columns everywhere, right? Let's build Corinthian columns for a quarter mile down this street, right? We can do it. We've got enough slaves and we've got enough money, we'll just do it. And so you can think about that differently. Some who want to say, yeah, we've used this column because it's carrying meaning and it's carrying, right? Can be more maybe insistent on the architecture. And it also means you pare away some things that another practitioner might say, but the language requires you put a pilaster here, but it's not carrying anything, right? So you might, that'd be a fascinating argument. That would be one I would want to have in my office. Well, this is a group that can't afford much of this ornament. So if we're going to use it, they want to maximize what it means. So we could be kind of taking a Greek approach to this building rather than a Roman approach to this building. And for some people, that would make some sense. Does that open up some possibilities? They're both beautiful. I'm not saying that one isn't beautiful. I personally like the spareness of some of the Greek architecture because it's easier these days. We have a kind of maybe it's a cultural place where we're wanting things that are cleaner, lighter. I don't think I have any Greek buildings to show you. Let's see what I have to think of some. Yeah, I'm always thinking about what's happening in the present. I mean, it might not sound like it to you, but I'm thinking of Dimitri Porphyrios, a British architect who is Greek by name, right? Who has done a building at Princeton, one of the new colleges at Princeton, and has done a lot of work in Great Britain. And he will tend to use, even if it's interpreting the columns into metal, he'll use a great building. I love this building in Birmingham in the UK by Porphyrios. Think about one of my professors at Notre Dame, a man named Richard Konomakis. He's Greek, yes, and he would, and maybe this makes him a little bit more of maybe a clue more of his modernity, because modernists would say that architecture has to be honest to its structure. And I think that's led to a lot of really, really ugly buildings. Like, yeah, okay, that's what's holding it up. I don't care. It's certainly not beautiful and I'm tired of it now, right? But if the buildings are beautiful and the meaning is double, right? It's carrying the weight and it's beautiful. That would, I would.
Inference in all this that we should be kind of, to some degree, mimicking the ancients. In some form of minor replication in order to reconstruct the environment.
Well, every person who's practicing classical architecture in the present is learning all the time from the whole history of what architecture has been in this language and learning how to use it most effectively in the present.
Interesting to say this, that there's a Discovery Channel show I watch from time to time, and they call it "If We Had to Build It Today." And they've gone all the way back to the pyramids and
Yeah, yeah.
Parthenon
Yeah.
and aqueducts and all that. So it's an amazing time of relation. Where we got all the modern, I use that word, guardedly, machinery, technology. They did not have.
So this is one of the early 20th century architects, Corbusier, maybe it's a name some of you know. He looked at the Parthenon and thought, oh, look, it's got all these parts that are the same. This lends itself to an industrialized approach to architecture. Right? All the parts are the same. It lends itself to one column. They're all the same. Just make them. Right? It's floor, roof, rafters, they're all the same. Just make them. Just use a machine, hit the button, and make them. As it turns out, Parthenon, there aren't two pieces in the Parthenon that weren't absolutely adjusted to their particular place in the building. So the columns on the corners are pulled in slightly. So the distance between the columns is slightly less, and they're tilted in. We do that visually because when you're looking at the Parthenon and you're looking at the corner, you see the sky beyond. It looks like, oh, they pulled the column out too far. It looks wrong, but it would have been mathematically right. Or you see what I'm setting up here, right? So the Greeks were totally in tune with. We start with the math, we adjust it to perception, then you get beauty. Otherwise, it just looks clinical, right? And so, but that list goes on and on. So the Parthenon stands on what's called the stylobate. The stylobate is crowned in the middle and slopes to the edges. Again, if you don't do that, it looks like it's sinking in the middle. Our eyes just do this. They just do this. We can complain to the Lord about the misfunction of our eyes when we get there. Or maybe the stigmatism will be gone, or I don't know what, but they adjust the mathematical perfection to what our eyes take in perceptually as being beautiful. No two parts in the Parthenon are made the same. So he chose it as a model for industrialization, not knowing he was absolutely wrong. And the thing that we should have been taking from it, and the thing we're trying to take from it now, is that it's the adjustments that are affective and lead our eyes to making judgments of beauty. This was not in the agenda for the day.
Well,
I hope this is okay with you all.
I think these questions are really critical, and obviously it's important to go back to mission and purpose.
Mm.
And I remember many discussions I had over many building campaigns was that whether it was a parent or a donor or whoever it was, teacher, hey, we're a school. So there's nothing we do at any point that's not instructional.
That's true.
And that's, well, and kind of what you were saying before, that you build the stripped down building that you can just get up as fast as possible. There's a lesson of selfishness to those donors that gave money. Well, I'm only giving this if it can be ready for my kids to graduate, right? But on the other side, if you spend ornately and you put things into things that have no function, and I think that aesthetic does have function, very important instructional function, right? And so what I found when you had those discussions, what are we really teaching? What are we saying to our students? What are we saying to the parents? What are we saying to donors? Those that work here with these spaces, because man, buildings are talking about labor intensive all the time to raise the money and design it and build it and then maintain it. There's almost nothing that takes that amount of effort and resources.
That's right.
And so I would always emphasize the fact this is instructional. So what are we wanting to teach by how we go about this and what we end up with? And so there were times we had buildings where I want to think about phases. Okay, we have to have, the city's making us leave these portables. So we have to have 6 classrooms and we have to have it in 14 months. That's just, we know it, right? And so we thought in terms of, okay, well, phase 1 of this is basically going to be this box and it's not terribly attractive, but we get the 6 classrooms that we need. But then when we add on these other pieces, and we thought about that beforehand, there's an aesthetic that will be there ultimately, because it was thought out beforehand. Anyway, I think it's really critical for us as schools to think about the instructional component of what all this brings to the table.
Yeah, let me expand that a little bit. So, I'm the way I read Aristotle. He was saying that every student prepared for civic participation should learn music and drawing because it cultivates a sense of judgment about politics, which is always circumstantial. If we build the cheapest possible thing, aren't we modeling that our civic life is not one to be valued, that it's only to be consumed? And so I'm also thinking of, I think it's the opening chapter of 2 Peter where it talks about the gifts of character. And it uses the word in that passage that's the same word to use what it is that Roman generals would give to Rome as amenities, as gifts of pleasantness, right? So they would build theaters. And those were gifts to the city. Now, it would also augment their fame and stature, no question about that. But there was a practice of giving to, a generosity of our practice. That is the word that Peter uses in the epistle to describe how it is that our character is an augmenting gift to what it is that we have been called to. It's a little bit wordy there, but you get the idea? I think the word is, well, it's been a little while since I've read that, but you can go back and check. It's the same word. So the word that we used to describe Agrippa's theater in Rome, it'd be the same word that's being used. So it is instructional, and it's setting an example, right, of our posture towards the world.
I also think there are strategic ways to think about developing a campus that we regularly do not entertain, particularly in classical Christian school movement, because we got to keep the initial price points as low as possible. Take land acquisition as an example. So there's a school over terribly far from here in Argyle, Texas, that moved from Denton down to Argyle, partially because they had some land donated to it. And so when they started building it, it's sort of out in the middle of nowhere. Well, then they built this school with these facilities, and what happened? Entire subdivisions and commercial, all this stuff came in and developed around the campus because the campus was something of a gravitational center, right? And the school, I think they were given 50 acres, they bought 30 acres more, so they had 80 acres. They could have built everything they used for the school on about 60 acres. And had they thought about that, the value of those other 20 acres, as everything started developing around it, got much, much higher. And so I really do think in terms of, if you need 40 acres for what you're going to build, and you could acquire 60 acres, do so, and then have the discipline to build on 40 acres. So the 20 acres that you bought, after you have created the marketplace gravitational pool, gives return back to the school. It is like a long-term investment, but it could be very lucrative for the school. Help.
Well, this is brilliant, and I'm hoping that we're gonna I'm gonna hear more from you, because this is a really, really interesting idea. But I would also say that the investment return might be much shorter, because building commercial real estate fills in when there's a market. It does, and then the return is very rapid. And so this is really, really an important idea. And you brought a plan diagram, and I'm realizing I didn't bring my tracing paper because I was going to roll some trace over it and we could talk about it, but maybe we'll find another. Oh, I'll take a photograph of it at our next break, which must be coming up. And then I'll draw it over it here and see if we can share that. Yes. And then the rest of you will understand what he's talking, what we're talking about.
question about designing a building that fits in with its surroundings. Earlier, or at the beginning of your talk, you referenced some little villages in Portugal that are just picturesque, and everyone loves visiting them, not because the buildings are particularly magnificent, but the space itself is harmonious and they frame things well.
Yeah.
Given that,
This must be the hard part coming. Okay.
Yeah. Given that a lot of times our cities are very eclectic and erratic in their construction, and so you'll have a big chunk that's these cookie cutter residential neighborhoods, then you'll have something completely different right next to it. How on earth do you even approach the problem of building something that is not only internally beautiful and internally consistent, but is in harmony with its surroundings? How can you do that if the surroundings themselves are not in harmony with one another?
Yes, and one of the great land planning challenges in the United States is what to do with sprawl, as it's in many places failing. So it's interesting. I mean, I mentioned this before, but some municipalities are beginning to see that the health outcomes, the energy invested in the way we've developed land is it's impoverishing a community rather than increasing wealth. Some of you might be interested. He was a career engineer in Minnesota, but he started a movement called Strong Towns. And his point is that municipalities have built an infrastructure that now is ruining municipal budgets because they can't support the expense of keeping it all going, right? Overbuilt streets, too many sewers, just so much. And so some municipalities are beginning to say, can we find a place in all of this where we could start making something that looks like a town again? So we're doing that in a couple different places in Virginia, where the municipality is trying really, really hard. And the worst enemy in this is state highway departments, because the purpose of a state highway department
Is to ruin life.
it is to move as many cars as rapidly from A to B. Now, in some places, what that mission is being changed, and state highway departments are saying that is not your only mission. Your mission includes the health and well-being of pedestrians. And for some engineers, that changes the landscape entirely. And then they can't just do the one thing. They've got to do a much more complex thing. And so sadly, it is the state highway departments that are the worst enemy. But to finish this, I don't think some modernist architects would say, if there's hell there, you build more hell. It reflects the context. No, you begin in the context, wherever we are, wherever we're planted, to begin to do a thing right. And it will over time overtake what's around it.
We are past time. You will keep going.
No, let's stop there.
I've got to get to my next session.
Oh, sorry, we're gonna miss you.